The morning sun filtered through the frosted glass of Nay's office, casting soft patterns across his spotless desk. He'd already seen a handful of patients that day, routine cases, predictable conversations, but when his assistant handed him the next file, something inside him hesitated. Mrs. Kate Morrison, it read. That name. It had been years, yet it carried the same quiet weight. The same unspoken story. He remembered her laughter faintly echoing through the clinic hallways years ago. Light, genuine, with a warmth that once made him forget the sterile walls around them. She was married back then, recovering from surgery, fragile but full of life. Nay had admired her strength, though he never allowed himself to look too long. He was her doctor, after all. Composed, respected, unreachable, at least that's what he told himself. Now, seeing her name again, a flicker of curiosity stirred beneath his calm exterior. What had become of her? Did she still carry that same spark in her eyes? As he straightened his white coat, he caught his reflection in the window. Older, more tired, but still holding that quiet confidence his patients trusted. And for the first time in years, his pulse quickened for a reason that had nothing to do with medicine. When the door opened, time seemed to bend just a little. Mrs. Kate stepped in, carrying herself with the calm poise of someone who had lived, lost, and learned. Her hair was shorter now, softer around her face, and her smile, though faint, had a trace of that old warmth. Nay rose to greet her, his voice steady, but his eyes gave him away. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Morrison," he said, and even to his own ears, it sounded more personal than professional. She laughed gently, that same familiar sound that once lingered in his memory. "It's been a long time, Dr. Nay," she replied, her tone layered with nostalgia. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither could name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was recognition, the kind that reminded them both that they had once shared unspoken thoughts, unfinished moments. Nay gestured toward the chair, careful not to let his hand tremble. As she sat, a silence settled, comfortable, yet full of meaning. The ticking of the wall clock suddenly felt louder. Nay glanced at her medical file, but didn't see the words. He was too focused on the curve of her voice, the way she clasped her hands in her lap. This was supposed to be routine, ordinary, yet nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. It felt like a page had just been reopened in a book neither of them ever finished reading. The consultation flowed easily, though neither of them truly listened to the words being said. Nay asked about her health, but his tone carried more warmth than formality. Kate responded politely, her answers soft, thoughtful, occasionally catching his gaze a moment too long. Every shared glance stretched the space between them tighter, as if the air itself had begun to hum. Neither dared to name it, yet both felt the familiar pull, quiet, dangerous, and intoxicating. As he examined her test results, Nay noticed how her perfume lingered, faint but unforgettable. It reminded him of late afternoons by the sea, calm, nostalgic, and just a little sad. She leaned forward, curious about a note on the chart, and for a fleeting second, her hand brushed the edge of his sleeve. It was innocent, accidental, but his breath caught anyway. The room suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights sharper. Something old had just been awakened. When she finally stood to leave, Nay escorted her to the door, trying to steady his voice. "Let's schedule your follow-up soon," he said, his tone neutral, too neutral. She nodded, her lips curving into a knowing smile that said more than words ever could. As the door closed behind her, Nay exhaled slowly, his composure cracking in the quiet. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a line he would soon cross. A week later, Nay found her name on his schedule again. His pulse quickened just as it had before, though he told himself it was nothing, just another follow-up. Still, he spent a moment too long straightening his tie, smoothing his sleeves, forcing calm where none existed. When Kate entered, her smile was softer this time, more open, as if they shared a secret no one else could see. "You again," she teased gently, and he couldn't help but return her smile. They spoke easily, almost like old friends catching up after years apart. She told him about her divorce, how quiet the house had become, how loneliness crept in at night. Her honesty disarmed him. Doctors hear confessions all the time, but this felt different. He saw the woman behind the patient, the vulnerability behind her grace, and for the first time in a long while, Nay felt seen too. Not as a doctor, not as a professional, but as a man. The conversation drifted far from her health, wandering into stories of books, travels, and quiet moments that shaped who they had become. Nay listened intently, forgetting the clock, forgetting the sterile walls. The more she spoke, the more he felt the world outside fade away. There was a tenderness in her tone, an ache that resonated with something buried deep inside him. By the time their laughter filled the room, a boundary had already begun to blur. The clinic was unusually quiet that afternoon, as if the world itself had slowed to give them space. Rain tapped softly against the window, creating a rhythm that filled the pauses between their words. Kate's gaze lingered on Nay longer now, searching, testing, almost daring him to look back. When he finally met her eyes, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, an invitation, a pull neither of them had the strength to ignore. She reached for the cup of tea he'd offered earlier, her fingers brushing his hand in the process. It was such a small gesture, yet it sent a jolt through him, sharp and unexpected. Nay froze for a moment, torn between instinct and reason. He should have stepped back, should have laughed it off, but instead he found himself caught in her quiet gravity. The air between them grew heavy, thick with words left unsaid. Her voice broke the silence, low and trembling. "I didn't mean to," she began, but Nay shook his head before she could finish. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than the rain outside. Every moral line he'd ever drawn began to blur beneath the weight of that single moment. And when she looked at him again, with those eyes full of fear and longing, he realized there was no going back to how things were before. Nay took a slow breath, but his calm facade was unraveling. He tried to speak, to redirect the moment, yet his words came out quieter than intended. "Kate, this isn't right," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. She looked at him with a fragile honesty that made his restraint falter. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but it feels real." That single sentence cracked whatever was left of his control. Their hands met first, hesitant, trembling, unsure whether to hold or retreat, but neither moved away. The world around them shrank to the space between their fingertips. When she rose from her chair, he didn't step back. The distance dissolved, replaced by a charged stillness that carried its own gravity. And then, without thought or plan, their lips met, a brief, trembling kiss that burned like confession. It wasn't passionate at first. It was tender, cautious, almost apologetic. Yet beneath that tenderness lay everything they had denied: the loneliness, the yearning, the quiet rebellion against who they were supposed to be. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, shaken by what had just happened. Nay turned away, eyes closed, torn between shame and longing. That single kiss had redrawn the map of everything they thought they knew. Days turned into weeks, and Kate found more reasons to visit the clinic. Sometimes it was a follow-up, other times an invented symptom, anything to justify seeing him again. Nay knew it wasn't right, yet he couldn't bring himself to stop her. Each meeting blurred the lines a little more, until their appointments became less about medicine and more about the magnetic pull between them. They spoke in low tones, as if the walls themselves were listening. Behind the closed door of Nay's office, the world felt suspended. There were stolen touches, lingering glances, moments that ended too soon and began again in memory. He told himself he could control it, that it was harmless, but the truth gnawed at him. Every time Kate laughed or whispered his name, a piece of his restraint slipped away. He was no longer the calm, untouchable doctor everyone admired. He was a man falling deeper into forbidden desire. Outside, life carried on. The hum of the clinic, the footsteps of nurses, the rustle of paperwork, all of it became background noise to a secret that was quietly consuming them both. When their hands met across the desk, when her perfume filled the room, Nay stopped pretending this was something the rhythm of their secret became dangerously familiar. Kate would arrive just after closing hours, when the clinic was almost empty, and Nay would unlock the door without hesitation. The world outside faded as soon as she stepped in. Her laughter filled the sterile room, turning it into something softer, almost sacred. They would talk for hours, sharing stories that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with what they missed in their lives: touch, warmth, understanding. Sometimes their conversations gave way to silence, the kind charged with unspoken emotion. She would reach for him, fingertips tracing the lines of his face as if memorizing him in the dim light. Nay would close his eyes, torn between the tenderness of the moment and the guilt clawing at the edges of his conscience. He knew every heartbeat was a risk, every breath a step further into a place he might never escape, yet he couldn't turn away. Outside the window, the city lights flickered like distant witnesses. Inside, Time lost its meaning. Nay's white coat would hang forgotten on the chair, a symbol of everything he was supposed to be: honorable, disciplined, untouchable. But in her arms, he wasn't Dr. Nay. He was just Nay, a man who had found something he didn't know he was missing. And even as guilt whispered his name, the temptation to stay burned louder. Each stolen encounter left Nay both exhilarated and hollow, a contradiction he couldn't reconcile. He would return to his duties the next morning, smiling and composed, while inside, a storm raged. Kate's presence lingered in his thoughts, the curve of her smile, the warmth of her hand, the sound of her laughter echoing in empty rooms. Every mundane task reminded him of what he was risking, yet he couldn't bring himself to stop. Their passion grew bolder, subtle, yet insistent, like a quiet fire that refused to die. Meetings that were once clinical became intimate rituals. Small gestures heavy with meaning, a hand lingering on a shoulder, a whisper too soft for anyone else to hear. Each moment deepened their bond while tightening the grip of guilt around Nay's heart. He was trapped in a delicate balance, intoxicated by desire yet terrified of the consequences, and still, they returned to each other, drawn by a gravity neither could resist. Behind closed doors, they explored the depth of their connection, a secret universe where the outside world ceased to exist. Yet with every stolen kiss, every lingering touch, the shadow of reality loomed ever closer, waiting to expose them, to shatter the fragile sanctuary they had built. Nay knew that sooner or later, the choice between desire and duty would become unavoidable. Whispers began to float through the clinic like a slow, creeping fog. Colleagues noticed Nay's distracted glances, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his attention seemed elsewhere. Kate's visits became bolder too, her laughter a little too loud, her smiles a little too knowing. It was no longer just their secret. The world around them was beginning to sense the shift. Every step, every glance, carried the weight of exposure. One afternoon, as Nay handed her a folder across the desk, their fingers brushed, sending sparks through the room. A nurse passed by, her gaze flickering, curiosity barely contained. Nay's chest tightened. The familiar thrill of their closeness now carried an undercurrent of dread. The very walls that once offered safety now felt like cages, enclosing them in a game with stakes higher than either wanted to admit. The tension became unbearable when an unexpected visitor appeared, Kate's ex-husband, or perhaps a nosy coworker, someone whose timing was dangerously precise. The air shifted, heavy with unspoken alarm. Every instinct screamed for Nay to retreat, to hide the evidence of their secret, but he hesitated, caught between self-preservation and desire. That fleeting moment, so ordinary yet so charged, forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. The close call left Nay shaken, his composure fraying at the edges. His mind replayed every gesture, every glance, as if searching for a clue he had missed. Kate sat across from him, calm on the surface, yet her eyes betrayed the same storm that churned inside him. They both knew how narrow the line had become, how one misstep could unravel everything. The thrill that had once drawn them together now carried a sharp edge of fear. Whispers in the hallways seemed louder, shadows longer. Colleagues exchanged glances that made Nay's chest tighten, as though the walls themselves were conspiring against him. Kate reached for his hand, tentative, a silent plea for reassurance. He wanted to pull away, to remind her of the consequences, but the warmth of her touch anchored him. In that moment, duty and desire collided, and neither could claim victory. That evening, after the clinic emptied, they lingered near the door, reluctant to separate. Rain began to fall outside, tapping a rhythm against the glass that mirrored the tension in their hearts. Nay's gaze met Kate's, and for a fleeting second, the world outside ceased to exist. The choice he had been avoiding, the clash between his professional integrity and the pull of his heart, loomed ever closer. Each second stretched like a wire ready to snap. The tension between them was unbearable, a storm held in fragile equilibrium. Nay's hands shook slightly as he closed the clinic door behind them, aware that each moment together risked everything he had built. Kate's eyes searched his, full of longing and unspoken questions. The gravity of their situation pressed down on him, but in the quiet, he felt a pull he could not resist. Desire and fear tangled, inseparable, each heartbeat echoing their forbidden connection. "Maybe we're too far gone," Nay whispered, his voice low, almost a confession. Kate reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, a small gesture weighted with meaning. "Or maybe we're exactly where we need to be," she replied, her tone steady despite the tremor in her fingers. That defiance, that hope, both thrilled and terrified him. The walls of the clinic seemed to close in, sealing them in a world that existed for no one else but them. As they parted that night, the threat of exposure lingered like a shadow. Every step back to reality felt heavier, every glance over his shoulder sharper. Nay knew the reckoning was coming, unavoidable and urgent. He had crossed lines that could never be erased, and now the consequences loomed closer than ever. And yet, despite the fear, despite the guilt, his heart refused to turn away from the pull of what they had begun. The clinic was quiet that evening, the lights dimmed to a soft glow, yet the air felt heavy with anticipation. Nay sat behind his desk, reviewing patient notes he barely remembered writing, his mind elsewhere. Kate's arrival was soft, almost hesitant, yet she carried herself with a determination that made his chest tighten. "I needed to see you one last time," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. The weight of their shared history hung between them, palpable and unrelenting. He rose slowly, trying to balance professionalism with the pull in his chest. "Kate, we need to talk," he murmured, aware that every word carried the weight of consequence. She stepped closer, and the scent of her perfume stirred memories of stolen moments, laughter, and the forbidden warmth that had consumed them. "I know," she whispered, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand. In that instant, the world outside ceased to exist, leaving only the fragile, aching connection that neither could ignore. They stood in silence, the tension almost unbearable. Nay felt the duality of his heart and conscience tearing him apart. Duty, reputation, morality, all clashed violently with desire, longing, and the intimacy they had nurtured in secrecy. Kate's gaze held his, unwavering yet vulnerable, as if daring him to make the impossible choice. And as the clinic clock ticked steadily, marking time in a world that seemed to have stopped for them, Nay realized the moment of decision had arrived. The air between them was electric, charged with every stolen touch, every whispered word from weeks past. Kate's hand lingered near his, almost daring him to respond, while his mind screamed caution. He knew what they had was real, undeniable, yet forbidden, a line that could never be crossed without consequence. Every memory of their passion, every brush of her fingers, tugged him closer, challenging his resolve with a force he hadn't anticipated. "Is this the end?" she asked softly, vulnerability threading her tone. Nay swallowed hard, the question echoing in the hollow space of his conscience. He wanted to say yes, to end it, to protect his life and career, yet every fiber of his being rebelled. The choice was no longer just about right or wrong, it was about what they had shared, what they had felt, and whether that could ever be forgotten. Each heartbeat felt like a drum, counting down the seconds until a decision had to be made. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, tentative, searching. The world outside faded completely. The rain, the lights, the distant hum of the city vanished in the gravity of the moment. Kate's eyes glistened with hope and fear, a reflection of his own inner turmoil. Nay's heart waged war against his mind, desire against duty, love against logic, and in that suspended moment, neither could tell which path would emerge, only that their lives had been irrevocably changed by the kiss that started it all. The night wrapped around them like a velvet curtain, isolating the clinic in a world all their own. Kate stepped closer, her presence both a comfort and a challenge. "Nay," she whispered, voice trembling just enough to betray her fear and hope. He held her gaze, searching for answers in her eyes that mirrored his own. Every instinct screamed for him to step back, to preserve what remained of his reputation, yet the pull of their connection was irresistible. He exhaled slowly, his hands brushing hers, lingering longer than propriety allowed. "I don't know if we can undo this," he admitted, his voice low, almost a confession. She smiled faintly, a mix of longing and acceptance, as if she understood that some things, once begun, could never truly end. In that fragile space between choice and consequence, they stood suspended, hearts intertwined, aware that this moment would define them forever. As the clock ticked on, neither made the first move to break away. Outside, the world continued unaware of the secret universe they had built within these walls. Inside, every heartbeat, Every glance, every quiet breath told the story of what they had shared. Whether they parted that night or fell into each other's arms again remained unspoken, but one truth lingered. The kiss that ignited their forbidden passion had changed their lives irreversibly, leaving them forever connected by desire, regret, and the fragile beauty of a love they could never fully claim.